floating exactly 1 million miles away from our fragile planet, within the freezing and desolate abyss of Lagrange Point 2, the mighty James Webb Space Telescopes silently realigned its 18 magnificent gold-plated beryllium mirrors to meticulously calibrate its highly sensitive near-infrared camera against what was historically documented as an absolutely empty patch of the primordial universe. Dedicated NASA astronomers sitting inside the heavily darkened control rooms of the Space Telescope Science Institute anticipated seeing nothing more than the gentle background static of standard cosmic microwave radiation, yet the bizarrely incoming telemetry data instantly overwhelmed their pristine digital monitors with an impossible and terrifying surge of raw infrared light, cascading from the unfathomable depths of the early cosmos. Instead of the expected sterile void of a nascent universe, the sophisticated sensors locked onto an unimaginably massive and impossibly mature structural entity burning violently at a staggering cosmological redshift exceeding Z equals 14.44, a metric strictly dictating that this colossal titan somehow fully existed just 300 million years after the theoretical dawn of time. Pushed entirely to its absolute physical limits, the mid-infrared instrument required the specialized onboard cryocooler to forcefully plunge operating temperatures down to a blistering 7 Kelvin, just to adequately process the sheer thermal intensity of this prehistoric leviathan, without systematically destroying the fragile internal circuitry of humanity's most expensive and advanced astronomical observation platform. Peering through the dense cosmic fog of unionized hydrogen gas, the composite images resolved into a sprawling, luminous cancer cell that appeared to be actively devouring the delicate surrounding space-time fabric with an insatiable and grotesque gravitational appetite that completely defied every established paradigm of early galactic formation formulated over the last century of modern astrophysics. Spectroscopic analysis executed in real time by the near-infrared spectrograph confirmed a terrifying and anomalous mass reading equivalent to tens of billions of solar masses, presenting a fundamental chronological paradox, because accumulating such astronomical density within such an infinitesimally brief window of early cosmic evolution is fundamentally forbidden by the standard cosmological model. A profound and chilling silence aggressively permeated the previously buzzing Mission Control Center as automated verification algorithms repeatedly returned a 99.7% signal anomaly rate, categorically eliminating any comforting possibility of temporary instrument malfunction, gravitational lensing distortions, or trivial background interference from a foreground stellar object. This impossibly ancient behemoth sat mocking our fragile scientific frameworks from across the unfathomable chasm of deep time, radiating an oppressive and highly structured metallic heat signature that mathematically proved it had already lived, died, and aggressively resurrected itself long before the very first primordial hydrogen clouds were supposedly allowed to gracefully ignite into young stars. The sheer physical presence of this anomalous cosmic titan operating efficiently during the universe's most infantile stage acts as a brutal sledgehammer, aggressively striking the fragile glass foundation of our deeply cherished Big Bang theory, forcing the most brilliant minds on Earth to suddenly confront the horrifying prospect that our entire understanding of reality is fundamentally defective. If this monstrous and fully matured celestial architecture was already dominating the freezing cosmic void a mere fraction of a second on the universal timeline, what infinitely older and infinitely more terrifying cosmic abominations are currently lurking just beyond the absolute threshold of our fragile technological vision, patiently waiting for us to finally look deep enough into the ultimate dark. As supercomputers at NASA process the precise spatial geometry surrounding this primordial titan, The resulting gravitational mapping reveals a horrifying, hyperdense anomaly expanding like a malignant cosmic cancer through the very fabric of the early universe, where its unbearable tidal forces stretch across millions of light years to actively tear apart delicate gas clouds before they can ever coalesce into stable star systems. At the heart of this ancient leviathan lies a violent, hyperdense core generating an unprecedented gravitational well that actively drags surrounding cosmic filaments into its hungry center, consuming entire protogalactic clusters, while releasing tremendous shockwaves of high-energy cosmic rays that permanently disrupt the delicate thermodynamic equilibrium required for the early cosmos to form stable structures. Computer simulations run by international astrophysicists depict an apocalyptic nightmare where the continuous accretion of matter into this impossible phantom warps local spacetime geometry so violently that surrounding light paths are twisted into horrific, tangled loops, creating localized subhorizons that continuously rip open the vacuum and cause vast swathes of virgin space to collapse inward like a crushing steel cage. Within the churning, incandescent density of this primordial monstrosity, hypernovas detonate in unrelenting succession, unleashing unimaginable radiation blasts that rip through the surrounding cosmos like blinding atomic shockwaves, while actively feeding the colossal gravitational engine, accelerating its relentless growth and driving it to devour everything within its expanding sphere of destruction. As astrophysicists trace these violent gravitational ripples outward from the anomaly, they discover that the structural integrity of the early cosmos is actively destabilizing under the sheer weight of this ancient titan, raising terrifying questions about how the infant universe could even support such intensely concentrated mass without immediately collapsing back into a single, cosmic-wide, primordial singularity. The existential horror deepens as astrophysicists realize this gravitational distortion is not isolated to its local cluster, but is actively sending vast, destructive shockwaves through the early cosmic web, severing primordial gas filaments that connect ancient galaxies and acting like a lethal cosmic virus that systematically dissolves the structural scaffolding, holding the entire infant universe together. If this sprawling structure is driven by supermassive black hole seeds, merging at unprecedented relativistic velocities, the kinetic and gravitational energy released should have completely vaporized the surrounding dark matter halo. Yet, observational spectral data shows the dark matter envelope remaining eerily intact and continuously funneling more pristine hydrogen into the ravenous central abyss. This terrifying breakdown of macro-scale physics at the farthest edges of observable space suggests that the fundamental constants governing our universe are not immutable laws, but fragile, temporary conditions that can be violently overwritten by the massive gravitational forces of these prehistoric leviathans, meaning that the serene physical stability governing our own solar system may be nothing more than a fleeting cosmic illusion. As the entity continues its violent expansion, its vast gravitational wake radiates endlessly into the dark void, steadily warping every light beam and cosmic web filament in its path like a colossal shockwave tearing through wet paper, forcing scientists to watch in helpless horror as the boundary between structured spacetime and chaotic void shrinks, bringing this ancient catastrophe ever closer to our galaxy. If this sprawling, reality-bending titan is already actively devouring the foundational structural architecture of the early universe with insatiable appetite, what catastrophic fate awaits when its expanding gravitational wave finally reaches our localized sector of space? And are we currently witnessing the terrifying opening moments of an inescapable cosmic collapse that will eventually erase everything humanity has ever known? For nearly an entire century, humanity has desperately sought deep psychological comfort in the elegant and highly predictable mathematical equations first proposed by astronomer Edwin Hubble, whose meticulous early observations of receding galactic light provided the foundational scientific scaffolding necessary to confidently construct our deeply cherished 13.8 billion-year-old cosmic origin story. This meticulously constructed Big Bang model subsequently served as an absolutely unbreakable scientific gospel for multiple generations of dedicated researchers, establishing a profoundly rigid and strictly unidirectional evolutionary timeline of thermal cooling, where the freezing dark void was only mathematically permitted to slowly give birth to the very first rudimentary and fragile stars, after hundreds of millions of silent years. Yet the sudden and violently unexpected discovery of this terrifyingly mature cosmic anomaly by the advanced optics of the James Webb Telescope brutally desecrates those hallowed historical archives forever, irreversibly overwriting the very fundamental and foundational laws of chronological cosmic evolution that our most celebrated cosmologists have relentlessly sworn by and defended with unwavering absolute certainty since the early 1920s. Even the brilliant Belgian physicist Georges Lemaitre, the pioneering scientific visionary who originally theorized the incredibly dense and highly volatile primeval atom, could never have possibly envisioned such a monstrous and fully developed primordial architecture actively thriving and dominating the dark void during an ancient epoch when the infant universe was supposed to be completely submerged in a thick and entirely lifeless plasma. We are now completely and utterly forced to relentlessly reckon with the genuinely horrifying scientific probability that the widely documented cosmic dark ages, long considered an untouchable and foundational cornerstone of historical astrophysics, was never actually a peaceful period of quiet, stellar gestation, but rather an intensely violent era entirely dominated by incredibly massive and completely incomprehensible structural leviathans. The incredibly intricate tapestry of cosmic microwave background radiation maps, which were so painstakingly and meticulously stitched together over countless decades by pioneering observation satellites like Kobe and Planck, are now instantly rendered terrifyingly obsolete as this singular impossible entity violently shreds the carefully plotted and long-accepted chronological evolutionary timeline of our entire known early universe forever. Every single foundational university textbook, every prestigious Nobel Prize, historically awarded for meticulously mapping the accelerated expansion of the cosmos, and every sleepless night spent frantically calculating the absolute age of the oldest globular clusters, now feels like a deeply tragic and entirely collective human delusion, carefully orchestrated by our own desperate evolutionary need to construct a perfectly logical reality. If this impossibly complex and profoundly heavy metallic-rich entity was already fully grown and aggressively operating at a blistering cosmological redshift of 14, we must immediately entertain the deeply chilling historical prospect that the celebrated Big Bang itself was absolutely never the definitive beginning of all creation, but merely a minor and highly localized cosmic detonation, hiding a significantly older and darker truth. Our once proud and fiercely defended historical legacy of groundbreaking astrophysical discovery is completely and instantly reduced to pathetic child's play as we stand entirely helpless before this massive primordial phantom, violently forced to publicly admit that humanity's entire conceptual understanding of the surrounding cosmos has been permanently constructed on top of a genuinely terrifying and fundamental mathematical cosmic lie. If the very foundational Genesis story of our seemingly peaceful universe is nothing more than a complete historical fabrication built on fundamentally flawed human mathematics, then exactly what other horrifying and invisible cosmic truths have we purposefully blinded ourselves to? And just how long until the actual, infinitely darker, and vastly more hostile reality of our terrifying universe finally awakens and ultimately consumes us. As the terrifying reality of this impossible primordial structure permanently settles into the collective consciousness of our global scientific community, a profoundly chilling and existential realization begins to painfully emerge that humanity's deeply cherished cosmological creation myth is fundamentally, completely, and irreversibly shattered forever by this ancient, brooding cosmic leviathan. Stripped of our comforting delusions regarding a highly structured and predictably expanding universe, we suddenly find our fragile species completely adrift within an overwhelmingly alien and hostile cosmos that owes absolutely no logical explanation to the insignificant biological entities temporarily occupying a pale blue dot on the extreme outer edges of the remarkably ordinary Milky Way galaxy. The agonizing silence of the great Fermi Paradox takes on a vastly more sinister dimension when viewed through the distorted gravitational lens of this impossibly mature entity, heavily suggesting that our desperate search for extraterrestrial biological intelligence has been purposefully ignored by an ancient universe that actively prioritizes the brutal and chaotic formation of supermassive monsters. Astrobiologists and theoretical philosophers are now violently forced to desperately reconsider the terrifying concept of the Great Filter, postulating that this ultimate existential barrier to advanced civilizations might not actually be a devastating future technological catastrophe, but rather a fundamental, ancient, and completely inescapable architectural flaw woven deeply into reality itself. Gazing desperately into the crushing darkness of this unexplainable cosmological anomaly suddenly and completely vaporizes human arrogance, aggressively reminding us that every single scientific triumph, cultural milestone, and philosophical revelation achieved throughout human history is mathematically indistinguishable from absolute zero when compared against the unfathomable timeline of this monstrosity. We must carefully confront the profoundly unsettling possibility that our precious and seemingly immutable physical laws, which gracefully govern the silent orbit of our isolated planetary home, are nothing more than a temporary and heavily localized illusion generated within a remarkably calm and incredibly brief cosmic pocket that is completely surrounded by a raging ocean of unfathomable madness. The incredibly heavy psychological burden of this impossible astrophysical knowledge begins to actively fracture the collective sanity of the brilliant men and women stationed at mission control, as they are violently forced to mentally process the truly terrifying fact that the seemingly beautiful and vast night sky is actually a deceptive, glittering mask, carefully hiding a terrifying primordial monster. Our collective sense of profound cosmic loneliness is violently magnified to an absolutely agonizing degree, because discovering this gargantuan structural impossibility confirms that humanity is not just completely alone in the endless dark, but that we are actively trapped inside a hostile, predatory environment that is entirely indifferent to our pathetic struggles for survival and basic understanding. As we hopelessly attempt to mathematically comprehend the incomprehensible parameters of this ancient titan, we are brutally stripped of the comforting and inherently human illusion of eventual cosmic mastery, realizing with absolute dread that no amount of technological progression will ever adequately protect our fragile biological species from the horrifying realities lurking at the edge of space-time. If this impossibly dark and ancient anomaly fundamentally proves that our entire universe was structurally built upon a terrifying foundation of absolute and chaotic madness, what completely unexplainable and reality-shattering forces will we inevitably unleash when we finally dare to point our most powerful and sophisticated instruments even deeper into the forbidden heart of this primordial abyss? Pointing its highly calibrated near-infrared spectrograph into the absolute deepest cosmological depths. The James Webb Space Telescope systematically dissects the incoming ancient photons to brutally uncover densely packed, fully mature stellar populations aggressively thriving a mere 300 million years after the theoretical Big Bang, instantly creating an unsolvable chronological paradox. This horrifyingly detailed spectroscopic data violently contradicts every single established cosmological model by revealing an impossible concentration of heavy elemental metallicity that mathematically requires multiple successive generations of explosive stellar death and violent rebirth, a highly complex evolutionary process that should absolutely take billions of years to successfully accomplish. Desperately attempting to process the sheer thermal intensity radiating from this primordial titan, the advanced onboard cryocooler forcefully plummets the sensitive internal mechanics down to a blistering 7 Kelvin, miraculously managing to isolate a terrifying residual heat signature emanating from the massive core that fundamentally and aggressively violates the known laws of thermodynamics. Calculating the raw energetic output derived directly from the primary infrared wavelengths, panicked astrophysicists realize this monolithic structure is generating an ungodly amount of focused thermal radiation that physically cannot be sustained by conventional nuclear fusion, heavily implying the presence of a significantly darker and completely unmapped power source, fueling its violent growth. The incredibly rigid and widely accepted mathematical parameters, carefully defining the standard model of particle physics, immediately begin to fracture under the crushing weight of this newly acquired telemetry data, forcefully demanding a complete and deeply humiliating scientific rewrite of exactly how basic baryonic matter is supposedly allowed to behave within the freezing, early cosmic vacuum. Meticulously cross-referencing the terrifying redshift values spiking wildly between z equals 13.2 and an impossible 16.5. The central processing mainframes at the Space Telescope Science Institute repeatedly confirm that this sprawling celestial behemoth physically contains vastly more concentrated mass than the entire localized universe surrounding it could theoretically supply. Translating the raw spectral emission lines into a visual rendering, the horrifying mathematical reality depicts a hyper-dense cosmic anomaly operating like a ravenous mechanical virus, actively stripping the primordial surrounding environment of all fundamental building blocks while violently emitting an unnatural electromagnetic hum that continuously disrupts our delicate sensory observation instruments. To historically accumulate this staggering volume of ultra-dense matter within a phenomenally restrictive temporal window of mere millions of years, the surrounding gravitational accretion rates must have forcefully exceeded the theoretical Eddington limit by an astronomical magnitude, violently suggesting that our absolute universal speed limit for structural growth is a deeply flawed terrestrial assumption. Staring helplessly at the relentless stream of impossible photometric data cascading down their frozen monitors, the stunned global scientific community desperately struggles to conceptually grasp how this violently churning primordial engine is single-handedly rewriting the fundamental thermodynamics of reality without immediately causing a catastrophic localized collapse of the entire surrounding space-time. If the most meticulously calibrated and highly advanced scientific instruments ever conceived by human intelligence are mathematically proving that our absolute laws of physics were completely broken at the dawn of time, exactly what other horrifying and ancient universal forces have been silently operating just outside our fragile field of view, while patiently waiting to ultimately devour our isolated galaxy. Decades ago, when the pioneering and deeply eccentric astronomer Fritz Zwicky boldly proposed the radical concept of invisible dark matter to meticulously explain the perplexing missing mass within the sprawling coma cluster, he fundamentally altered humanity's fragile understanding of the universe by chillingly suggesting that the vast majority of our cosmic reality was completely and utterly hidden in the dark. Yet even his most aggressively radical mathematical equations, desperately calculating the absolute theoretical maximum density of invisible non-baryonic matter, miraculously fall pathetically and tragically short of accurately explaining the impossible and utterly terrifying gravitational footprint actively being generated by this ancient primordial anomaly violently burning brightly at the absolute dawn of time. The highly celebrated and meticulously detailed cosmic microwave background radiation map, beautifully captured by the Planck observation satellite, was universally considered the absolute undisputed historical blueprint of our nascent cosmos, but supposedly providing a flawless and completely serene visual documentation of a highly uniform thermodynamic cooling period that peacefully birthed the very first fragile atoms. Suddenly and violently, that incredibly comforting chronological timeline of a peacefully maturing and logically expanding infant universe is instantly rendered terrifyingly obsolete as the sheer impossible structural maturity of this newly discovered dark anomaly aggressively and maliciously overwrites well over half a century of strictly defended and widely accepted theoretical astrophysics without a single warning. Entire generations of brilliant cosmological scientists who proudly accepted prestigious Nobel Prizes for carefully and meticulously mapping the standard inflationary model now tragically find their entire cumulative life's work brutally reduced to completely irrelevant and inherently flawed mathematical fairy tales, while desperately standing in the oppressive, suffocating shadow of this colossal, primordial phantom. The infamous cosmic dark ages were historically strictly taught in every prestigious global university as a remarkably quiet and completely invisible evolutionary era, where oceans of unionized hydrogen gas gracefully drifted through an overwhelmingly empty void, supposedly just patiently waiting for the universe's very first primitive and fragile stellar engines to slowly ignite within the absolute freezing darkness. We are now tragically and forcefully required to deeply recognize that those completely unseen historical epochs were actually dominated from the shadows by unfathomable ancient hyperstructures, violently and maliciously ripping apart the delicate gravitational scaffolding of the early universe, long before our modern understanding of natural physical mechanics could even properly establish itself across the silent void. Delving deeply into the long-forgotten and heavily dusty historical archives of early 20th century theoretical astronomy, panicked researchers suddenly uncovered deeply troubling mathematical anomalies and massive gravitational inconsistencies that were purposefully and deliberately ignored by anxious scientists who were desperately attempting to mathematically construct a perfectly uniform and predictable early universe. This monumental and completely reality-breaking discovery permanently and aggressively erases humanity's deeply ingrained intellectual arrogance by definitively proving that the beautifully elegant historical models of universal genesis were truly nothing more than a profoundly desperate psychological coping mechanism subconsciously designed to hide our fragile biological species from an infinitely more horrifying cosmic truth. If our most celebrated and heavily defended historical equations, strictly defining the fundamental evolutionary nature of the ancient infant universe, are completely and violently incorrect, exactly what terrifying cosmic forces have been secretly orchestrating the chaotic expansion of reality right behind our blind backs, and what apocalyptic outcome will inevitably occur when those hidden physical laws finally reach Earth. If the fundamental physical laws governing observable space can be so violently broken by this ancient Leviathan, then the delicate gravitational equilibrium stabilizing our solar system is merely a temporary illusion waiting to be shattered, especially as the massive core of this primordial phantom warps local space-time geometry while sending invisible gravitational shockwaves across the cosmic web to threaten planetary stability. Theoretical models simulating the extreme gravitational wake of this impossibly dense structure show the fabric of space-time stretching like a thin rubber membrane under unbearable mechanical tension, while localized mass density exceeding theoretical safety thresholds causes microscopic quantum tears to rupture throughout the vacuum, creating expanding singularities that devour surrounding energy fields and collapse neighboring structures. Raging at the heart of this ancient anomaly, titanic gravitational forces twist the light paths of star systems into distorted loops and generate monstrous tidal disruptions that rip apart protogalactic cores, while intense gravitational friction unleashes blinding torrents of gamma radiation that sterilize millions of cubic light-years of space to leave a desolate graveyard of atomized plasma across its horrific expanding footprint. As the entity continuously absorbs vast quantities of pristine matter, its ravenous growth triggers an unstoppable chain reaction of gravitational implosions that violently fracture the cosmic web filaments connecting ancient galaxies, causing nearby proto-galaxies to be dragged helpless into the roaring accretion vortex where their atomic bonds are destroyed and converted into extreme magnetic fields that pulse across the void. Astrophysicists analyzing shock-wave dynamics calculate that this catastrophic gravitational collapse is propagating through space-time at relativistic velocities, leaving behind a wake of altered reality where fundamental physics ceases to function and any cosmic structure caught within this expanding boundary suffers immediate disintegration as subatomic forces fail to hold particles together under the crushing weight of the metric. Deep within the burning interior of this primordial monstrosity, supermassive star seeds detonate as hypernovas in rapid succession, sending plasma shockwaves through the dense atmosphere and tearing open localized event horizons while releasing ungodly amounts of gravitational radiation that resonate through the vacuum, distorting surrounding deep space light and turning the early cosmos into an infernal, inescapable death trap. Supercomputer simulations mapping these violent distortions suggest that the entity's absurdly concentrated mass could trigger a true vacuum decay event, where a bubble of lower energy space-time expands at light speed to overwrite nature's laws, resulting in a catastrophic phase transition that would ruthlessly alter atomic structures and instantly dissolve complex matter, star systems, and life into a featureless sea of cold energy. Even though this monstrous phantom is situated billions of light-years away, its immense gravitational footprint acts like a cosmic magnet that slowly draws neighboring superclusters into an inescapable whirlpool of catastrophic convergence, ensuring that as our local group is pulled toward this nexus, the galactic orbits sustaining the Milky Way will experience devastating tidal forces that will strip away our outer stellar arms. Watching this ancient catastrophe unfold across deep time forces scientists to confront the nightmare that the peaceful universe we inhabit is merely an isolated island of stability in a violent ocean of chaos that is actively reclaiming its domain, while a chilling realization takes hold that the structural integrity of reality is unwinding from the outside in as this titan destroys the space-time foundations allowing planets to exist. If the fabric of reality is already tearing apart at the edge of observable space, under the unbearable weight of this impossible primordial leviathan, how much longer can our fragile solar system remain sheltered within its peaceful pocket of space before this expanding gravitational wave reaches us? And what mind-shattering physical laws will replace the universe as we know it when the cosmic tears finally consume our world? The profoundly terrifying philosophical implications of this impossible cosmological anomaly forcefully command humanity to brutally confront the agonizing and profoundly solitary nature of our fragile existence. As we suddenly realize we are helplessly trapped within an uncaring and infinitely vast cosmic ocean that aggressively ignores our desperate, pathetic pleas for basic scientific meaning and rational structure. For countless generations, we comfortably wrapped our vulnerable minds in the profoundly comforting delusion that the fundamental laws of physics were universal and benevolent rules designed to maintain cosmic harmony, rather than just temporary and highly localized atmospheric conditions, strictly governing a minuscule pocket of calm space, completely surrounded by a raging storm of primordial madness. Staring helplessly at the relentless and incomprehensible telemetry data beaming down from the freezing abyss, our most celebrated theoretical philosophers now tragically acknowledge that the beautiful clockwork predictability of our solar system is nothing more than a fleeting mathematical anomaly that will eventually be violently erased by the overwhelming chaotic entropy dominating the wider cosmos. The terrifying concept of cosmic loneliness takes on a violently visceral and oppressive weight as we mentally digest the undeniable mathematical proof that our majestic universe was absolutely never designed to eventually nurture delicate biological life forms, but instead exists solely to blindly churn out monstrous and hyperdense leviathans that systematically crush any semblance of logical reality. Every single magnificent cultural achievement and groundbreaking technological triumph recorded throughout the entirety of human history is instantly rendered phenomenally insignificant and pathetically microscopic when measured against the unfathomable temporal scale and staggering physical majesty of an ancient structure that essentially rewrote the foundational laws of physics before time even began. We are now permanently burdened with the horrifying and mind-shattering psychological realization that our frantic search for extraterrestrial intelligence is entirely pointless, because any advanced civilization attempting to navigate this primordial slaughterhouse would have been instantaneously eradicated by the fluctuating and violently unstable physical parameters radiating from these dark behemoths. Stripped entirely of our deeply ingrained and fiercely defended intellectual arrogance, our terrified global scientific community must painfully admit that humanity is essentially a blind organism aimlessly wandering through an infinitely dark and hostile wilderness without a map, desperately clinging to outdated evolutionary instincts while surrounded by completely unexplainable architectural terrors. The agonizing mathematical silence forcefully echoing throughout the great Fermi Paradox is no longer considered a perplexing scientific mystery, but rather a completely logical and profoundly horrifying consequence of existing within a fundamentally broken universe where the invisible cosmic predators lurking in the deep darkness are structurally hardwired to annihilate order and violently consume light. As the profoundly unsettling existential dread slowly paralyzes the brilliant minds analyzing the celestial anomaly, a terrifying ideological shift occurs, where the highly romanticized concept of cosmic exploration is permanently replaced by an overwhelming and desperate biological urge to remain completely hidden from the predatory cosmic forces, silently manipulating the fundamental fabric of existence. If our desperate and pathetic reliance on these temporary and localized physical laws has left our fragile biological species completely exposed and entirely unprepared for the actual chaotic nature of reality, what apocalyptic psychological collapse will inevitably shatter global society when the horrifying truth regarding the entity's true overarching purpose is finally successfully mathematically decoded? By precisely aligning the astonishingly sensitive optics of the highly advanced near-infrared spectrograph directly toward the terrifying core of this primordial anomaly, The James Webb Space Telescope meticulously intercepts incredibly ancient photons that have desperately traveled across billions of light years of aggressively expanding space-time to finally deliver their horrifying raw data to our fragile sensors. As the sophisticated onboard supercomputers meticulously translate these raw infrared wavelengths into highly detailed spectral graphs, the stunned astrophysicists sitting in mission control are violently confronted with completely impossible emission lines that fundamentally contradict every single established paradigm regarding the absolute maximum rate of primordial galactic chemical evolution allowed by modern physics. The meticulously processed spectroscopic data undeniably reveals an unfathomable and completely terrifying saturation of complex heavy elements like carbon and nitrogen existing within a staggering cosmological redshift of 14. Mathematically proving this massive structure possesses an extreme degree of metallicity that fundamentally and absolutely should not exist during the delicate infancy of our entire universe. According to every strictly verified and universally accepted astrophysical textbook, the highly complex atomic forging of such incredibly heavy metallic elements definitively requires multiple successive generations of massive stars to peacefully live, violently explode in supernovas, and meticulously seed the surrounding dark cosmos over a profoundly extended chronological evolutionary period spanning billions of years. Yet this impossibly ancient and sprawling cosmic leviathan is somehow aggressively churning out these highly advanced atomic chemical signatures a mere 300 million years after the initial Big Bang expansion, indicating a terrifyingly violent and hyper-accelerated continuous cycle of stellar death and localized rebirth that maliciously defies the fundamental thermodynamic laws strictly governing our reality. In order to forcefully generate this specific and heavily concentrated spectroscopic fingerprint, the churning inner core of the terrifying anomaly must be operating as an apocalyptic nuclear furnace that ruthlessly compresses primordial hydrogen into advanced heavy metals at a continuous, blistering relativistic velocity that would absolutely and instantaneously vaporize the structural integrity of any normal galaxy. Frantically analyzing the relentless and overwhelming terabytes of highly disturbing optical telemetry continuously beaming down to Earth from the freezing Lagrange point 2 orbit, the deeply panicked global scientific community realizes the entire established cosmic timeline of elemental distribution has been completely, violently, and irreversibly shattered forever by this single monstrous primordial celestial phantom. These deeply unnerving and highly erratic spectral readouts essentially paint a horrifying mathematical picture of a ravenous, hyperdense structural engine actively cannibalizing its own surrounding dark matter halo to perpetually fuel an unholy and completely unnatural metallurgical refining process that fundamentally and aggressively predates the absolute theoretical dawn of observable time itself within the cosmos, with every single subsequent spectroscopic scan repeatedly confirming the absolute and terrifying validity of these impossible heavy emission lines. Our most brilliant planetary astrophysicists are violently forced to unceremoniously toss their heavily cherished historical models of primordial chemical evolution directly into the metaphorical and utterly humiliating intellectual fire of complete human scientific ignorance. If this impossibly complex and highly metallic-rich primordial architecture was actively fully operational during the absolute darkest infancy of our known universe, what truly horrific and completely unfathomable ancient mechanisms are responsible for forcefully forging these advanced elements? And was the celebrated Big Bang actually just a devastating localized byproduct of this terrifying monster finally waking up? As supercomputers convert the complex spectral data into vivid physical simulations, an apocalyptic vision emerges of thousands of hypernovas, detonating in rapid succession within the entity's monstrous core, unleashing unprecedented bursts of energy that violently shred surrounding hydrogen clouds and transform the primordial cosmos into a churning inferno of radioactive plasma that completely incinerates any possibility of peaceful galactic evolution. Each cataclysmic stellar death generates localized gravitational ruptures that tear through the fragile fabric of early space-time, causing surrounding gas filaments to collapse into ultra-dense pockets while unleashing blinding shockwaves of gamma radiation that sterilize millions of cubic light-years in every direction, turning the infant universe into a desolate graveyard where cosmic architecture is systematically annihilated before it can stabilize. Deep inside this sprawling primordial titan, dozens of intermediate black holes are constantly forced into violent, high-speed collisions by the overwhelming central gravity, sending massive gravitational waves reverberating across the early cosmic web and warping the trajectories of pristine gas streams into inescapable, churning whirlpools that continuously feed the central anomaly's unquenchable hunger for matter and energy. The unrelenting accretion dynamics operating within the entity's core produce extreme magnetic field distortions that twist surrounding spacetime into violent relativistic jets, blasting streams of superheated matter through neighboring star-forming regions and causing catastrophic thermodynamic disruptions that permanently extinguish the fragile stellar nurseries necessary for the birth of normal, stable galaxies. This continuous inferno generates an expanding wall of superheated shockwaves that radiates outward at near-light speeds, pulverizing surrounding dark matter halos and carving a massive, sterile void around the anomaly that acts like an expanding cosmic dead zone where no stable atomic bonds can survive the raw thermal violence radiating from the prehistoric Leviathan's central combustion engine. Neighboring proto-galactic clusters, caught within the vast gravitational reach of this ancient nightmare, are ruthlessly dragged toward the central abyss like helpless prey, where immense tidal forces stretch their stellar structures into elongated ribbons of superheated gas before they are violently crushed and consumed by the roaring accretion disk that completely dominates the absolute edge of observable space. As the entity's total mass surges far beyond every theoretical limit, the local space-time geometry ruptures into chaotic gravitational vortices that bend light rays into closed loops, creating a terrifying optical nightmare where the reflected illumination of exploding hypernovas is trapped in endless temporal echoes that completely obscure the true horrifying boundaries of this expanding cosmic cancer. The catastrophic energy output produced by these unrelenting stellar deaths acts as a massive galactic engine that propels violent shock fronts through the surrounding intergalactic medium, driving a wave of absolute destruction that strips fundamental particles of their mass and converts vast swathes of pristine cosmic volume into an empty, chaotic wasteland dominated by raw gravitational entropy. Astrophysicists watching these simulated cataclysms unfold on their high-resolution monitors are gripped by a visceral, paralyzing horror as they realize that the infant universe was not a serene, pristine incubator for future life, but rather a violent, chaotic slaughterhouse where titanic primordial monsters waged an unholy war against the fundamental laws of physics that govern our modern reality. If the violent, unrelenting hypernovas raging within this impossible primordial titan are continuously generating an expanding shockwave of cosmic destruction that is actively tearing apart the foundational structural web of early space-time. How many billions of years do we truly have left before this ancient wave of apocalyptic erasure finally reaches our sector of space to permanently extinguish our sun and erase Earth from existence? When the brilliant physicist Albert Einstein originally formulated his groundbreaking theory of general relativity, He deliberately introduced the infamous cosmological constant to artificially stabilize his mathematical universe, desperately attempting to prevent his beautiful equations from violently predicting a dynamic cosmos that was either collapsing inward or expanding into a chaotic void. He famously retracted this specific mathematical adjustment years later after Edwin Hubble definitively proved universal expansion, publicly labeling the constant as his greatest professional blunder, while entirely failing to realize that this hurriedly rejected mathematical framework actually hid a significantly darker and vastly more terrifying cosmic reality currently lying dormant in the abyss. Today, as the James Webb Space Telescope brutally beams down highly corrupted spectral data from this ancient gravitational leviathan, Einstein's fiercely protected theories of relativity are fundamentally buckling under the sheer astronomical weight of a primordial structure that maliciously defies every single metric of space-time curvature originally calculated by 20th century astronomers. Desperate modern astrophysicists are now frantically digging through the heavily dusty and historically marginalized archival notes of past scientific visionaries, chillingly discovering that the deeply buried mathematical anomalies and agonizing observational doubts of those early pioneers were never actual miscalculations, but rather terrifying prophetic warnings of this exact structural collapse. These forgotten astronomical records meticulously detail inexplicably violent gravitational lensing effects and completely bizarre optical distortions that briefly terrified earlier researchers before being cowardly swept under the academic rug to fiercely protect the soothing psychological illusion of a perfectly uniform, safely expanding universe, strictly governed by absolute mathematical logic. We are now violently forced to accept the horrifying historical truth that those brilliant historical minds subconsciously detected the terrifying localized gravitational ripples of this impossibly massive primordial entity, yet their primitive optical technology fundamentally restricted them from successfully identifying the colossal cosmic leviathan actively tearing apart the boundaries of reality. The foundational architecture of general relativity dictates that such intense concentrations of hyperdense mass existing so incredibly early in the chronological timeline should absolutely cause the entire localized universe to immediately collapse back onto itself. Yet this sprawling structural nightmare remains perfectly stable while maliciously mocking a century of established human physics. Every single prestigious scientific academy and celebrated astronomical institution must now deeply reckon with the agonizing realization that humanity's entire intellectual heritage was meticulously built upon a profoundly flawed framework of temporary physical assumptions that only applied to our extremely sheltered and incredibly brief microscopic window of localized universal evolutionary history. The agonizing historical tragedy lies fundamentally in the undeniable fact that our most celebrated theoretical physicists unknowingly map the intricate shadows of a beautiful cosmic illusion, completely failing to conceptually comprehend that the actual universe is a fiercely hostile and completely chaotic slaughterhouse, secretly dominated by unfathomable hyperstructures forged before time began. If the absolute brightest scientific minds in the entire recorded history of human civilization were purposefully misled by the deceptive architectural geometry of this deeply terrifying cosmos, what genuinely apocalyptic and reality-destroying mathematical truths have yet to be violently uncovered as the James Webb Telescope finally peers directly into the absolute black heart of this primordial beast? By staring deeply into the highly corrupted ancient spectral data continuously provided by the meticulously calibrated near-infrared spectrograph, we completely and violently shatter any comforting philosophical illusion that fragile humanity successfully occupies a special, biologically privileged position within the vast evolutionary timeline of our terrifyingly dark and ever-expanding primordial cosmic ocean. The agonizing silence of the great Fermi Paradox is no longer viewed as a baffling mystery of missing extraterrestrial civilizations, but rather as a chilling testament to the absolute hostility of a cosmos that favors the violent creation of these impossibly massive, reality-bending primordial architectures over the microscopic, pathetic biological chemistry necessary for carbon-based life to somehow emerge. Knowing that this titanic and heavily industrialized cosmic leviathan was already actively manipulating the fundamental fabric of space-time a mere 300 million years after the initial expansion forces astrobiologists to hopelessly realize that conscious biological life on Earth is merely a completely insignificant afterthought, accidentally spawned in a forgotten and entirely irrelevant universal backwater. Every single desperate radio transmission and golden record we have enthusiastically hurled into the freezing void with the pathetic hope of contacting benign alien intelligence is utterly mathematically indistinguishable from absolute nothingness when measured against the unfathomable chronological maturity and apocalyptic raw gravitational power possessed by this terrifying entity burning at redshift 14. The crushing psychological burden of conceptualizing this impossible prehistoric monument aggressively dismantles our deeply ingrained intellectual arrogance, violently replacing humanity's celebrated historical narrative of eventual universal exploration with a profoundly agonizing and paralyzing existential dread regarding our absolute helplessness in the face of such ancient, incomprehensible physical machinery. We are fundamentally forced to collectively accept the deeply horrific reality that the supposedly beautiful, star-filled night sky we have romantically gazed upon for countless millennia is nothing more than a highly deceptive, glittering temporary curtain deliberately concealing a terrifying primordial slaughterhouse where monstrous gravitational predators have ruthlessly reigned supreme since the dawn of time. The meticulously recorded heavy metallicity and violent hypernova data continuously streaming into the Space Telescope Science Institute from this ancient anomaly acts as a brutal philosophical sledgehammer, definitively mathematically proving that the universe was completely structurally optimized for extreme cosmic violence rather than the delicate, agonizingly slow gestation of intelligent biological organisms. This mind-shattering revelation completely aggressively recontextualizes the profoundly terrifying concept of the Great Filter, suggesting that the ultimate insurmountable barrier to advanced galactic civilization is not self-destruction, but the undeniable fundamental architectural reality that the entire cosmos is actively rigged to systematically eradicate frail atomic structures using massive gravitational anomalies. Recognizing our absolute and total cosmic irrelevance in the terrifying shadow of this ancient celestial leviathan leaves the entire global scientific community completely paralyzed, with a profound, agonizingly deep sense of existential dread, desperately wishing we could somehow permanently unsee the catastrophic mathematical truths successfully decoded from those deeply corrupted and highly ancient infrared photons. If the agonizingly empty silence of the known cosmos is actually the direct apocalyptic result of this sprawling primordial entity violently sterilizing the early universe of any potential biological competitors, exactly what terrifying and completely inescapable fate awaits our highly exposed and incredibly fragile solar system when the entity's infinitely expanding gravitational shockwave finally reaches Earth? Desperately attempting to logically categorize this terrifying primordial leviathan, mainstream astrophysicists initially propose that the anomaly is actually an exceptionally dense cluster of highly active supermassive black holes, cleverly disguised as a massive concentration of incredibly compact galactic structures, commonly referred to by researchers as little red dots. By aggressively pushing the highly sensitive optical arrays of the James Webb Telescope's near-infrared camera to their absolute physical limits, researchers desperately attempt to mathematically untangle the overlapping electromagnetic signatures radiating from these supposed black holes to prove they are just standard accretion disks consuming surrounding hydrogen gas. However, the meticulously gathered and highly corrupted spectral telemetry data almost instantly shatters this comforting theoretical hypothesis, because the extreme cosmological redshift definitively proves these supposed accretion disks are violently burning at a staggering thermal intensity that absolutely defies the fundamental Eddington limit of gravitational feeding. For these theoretical primordial black holes to successfully generate such an impossibly massive and luminous infrared footprint so early in the evolutionary timeline, they would have to be devouring pristine matter at a relentless relativistic velocity that would simultaneously trigger catastrophic radiation blowback and violently starve their very own central cores. Further complicating this desperate scientific scramble for a rational explanation, the heavily shielded mid-infrared instrument captures a distinctly anomalous thermal radiation pattern that completely lacks the characteristic X-ray emissions universally associated with standard supermassive black hole consumption, suggesting a vastly more terrifying and unknown mechanism. Calculations processed by supercomputers at the Space Telescope Science Institute ruthlessly confirm that combining thousands of these hypothetical little red dots mathematically fails to account for even 10% of the horrific gravitational mass actively warping the localized spacetime fabric surrounding this completely impossible and heavily structured cosmic titan. The complete and absolute failure of the active galactic nuclei hypothesis leaves the terrified global astrophysical community violently stripped of their most reliable and heavily defended theoretical shield, forcing them to confront the agonizing probability that this monolithic structure is driven by a fundamentally exotic and highly predatory physical power source. Meticulously analyzing the highly anomalous photometric redshift spikes scattered throughout the corrupted optical data, panicked researchers realize that standard gravitational friction models are entirely incapable of explaining how this massive primordial engine seamlessly maintains its terrifying structural integrity without immediately collapsing into a singularity. As the desperate and highly prestigious academic institutions frantically abandon their completely shattered mainstream physical models, they are violently forced to begin seriously exploring aggressively radical and deeply disturbing alternative cosmological theories that dangerously flirt with completely rewriting the foundational mathematical laws of our known reality. If this sprawling and impossibly mature primordial leviathan is definitively not powered by the catastrophic gravitational friction of devouring black holes, exactly what ungodly and completely invisible cosmic mechanism is violently driving its relentless expansion? And how long until that dark physics inevitably bleeds into our own fragile sector of the universe? By frantically digging deep into the marginalized and heavily dusty historical archives of early 20th century theoretical cosmology, a deeply terrified faction of radical astrophysicists violently resurrects the beautifully long-forgotten mathematical models of an endlessly cyclical universe to desperately attempt to logically explain the impossible presence of this primordial structural leviathan. This highly controversial and fiercely debated historical cosmological hypothesis aggressively suggests that our deeply cherished Big Bang was absolutely never the definitive beginning of all time, but rather just a localized and temporary energetic rebound, occurring immediately after the catastrophic and completely devastating gravitational collapse of a vastly older and infinitely darker previous cosmic iteration. According to these deeply unnerving and newly resurrected ancient mathematical equations, the unfathomable primordial anomaly currently being aggressively detected by the highly sensitive optics of the James Webb Space Telescope is actually an impossibly resilient architectural relic that miraculously survived the apocalyptic and completely annihilating universal crunch that violently erased the preceding reality. For countless decades, the most prestigious global astronomical institutions deliberately and cowardly brushed aside these terrifyingly cyclic models due to an absolute lack of concrete observational evidence, comfortably choosing to blindly embrace the mathematically serene and highly predictable unidirectional expansion timeline that fundamentally promised humanity a highly rational and easily understandable universe. However, that profoundly soothing and desperately maintained intellectual comfort has now been completely and violently stripped away forever by the undeniable and heavily corrupted spectral telemetry, aggressively confirming beyond any mathematical doubt that this impossibly massive and highly structured cosmic phantom definitively predates the fundamental formation of our completely fragile and isolated space-time fabric. In order to successfully withstand the absolutely unimaginable and completely annihilating raw thermodynamic pressure of a collapsing previous universe, the incredibly dense central core of this dark primordial leviathan must be fundamentally composed of highly exotic and completely indestructible degenerate matter that actively repels the catastrophic and immensely crushing gravitational forces of a localized Big Crunch. This deeply terrifying historical realization violently and mathematically forces the global scientific community to helplessly accept that the fundamental physical laws gently governing our current reality are truly nothing more than temporary and highly fragile atmospheric byproducts, hastily generated upon the scattered and completely pulverized cosmic ruins of countless dead universes that were systematically consumed by these immortal predators. Peering directly into the blinding and heavily corrupted infrared emissions radiating violently from this ancient architectural survivor definitively proves that fragile humanity is helplessly floating completely blind inside an endless cosmic graveyard, where the terrifyingly massive ghosts of previously annihilated realities continue to aggressively manipulate the fundamental structural evolutionary pathways of our newly birthed cosmos. If this impossibly old and completely indestructible primordial relic is genuinely a physically surviving and actively functioning remnant forcefully carried over from a devastatingly collapsed previous universe, it is absolutely and maliciously carrying the heavily concentrated gravitational seeds of the next inevitable cosmic apocalypse directly into the highly vulnerable heart of our rapidly expanding and entirely defenseless local star cluster. As this immortal and utterly incomprehensible celestial leviathan violently awakens from its unimaginably ancient slumber to actively begin aggressively consuming the fragile primordial hydrogen of our terrified infant universe, exactly how many billions of years truly remain before its infinitely expanding gravitational hunger successfully triggers the premature architectural collapse of our entire reality and violently resets the dark cosmic cycle. The most terrifying and radically aggressive hypothesis is currently circulating among deeply panicked theoretical physicists, posits that this impossible anomaly is not a static structural entity, but an active and apocalyptic dark matter annihilation event that is violently and systematically erasing all surrounding normal baryonic material from the extremely delicate primordial cosmic web without any mercy. Operating like a profoundly lethal and entirely invisible cosmic virus spreading relentlessly through the frigid vacuum of early space, This catastrophic self-sustaining chain reaction brutally converts perfectly stable atomic bonds into highly chaotic and completely sterile bursts of pure kinetic energy that leave behind absolutely nothing but an impossibly dark and fundamentally broken structural void. Mathematical simulations running continuously on NASA supercomputers mathematically suggest that this monstrous thermodynamic conversion process is actively expanding outward at blistering relativistic velocities, exceeding 99% the speed of light, effectively vaporizing billions of cubic light-years of pristine cosmic real estate while remaining completely undetected by standard optical sensors. As this ravenous and infinitely expanding wave of absolute localized cosmic erasure ruthlessly violently intersects with newly forming proto-galactic clusters, the immense gravitational friction generated by the colliding dark matter particles instantaneously shreds the infant star systems into microscopic subatomic shrapnel before completely absorbing their remaining thermal signatures into the churning abyss. Because the foundational scaffolding of our entire known universe is primarily composed of this highly volatile and invisible dark matter, the primordial engine driving this colossal anomaly effectively possesses an absolutely limitless and completely unquenchable fuel source that practically guarantees its monstrous and violently destructive expansion will mathematically never cease under normal physical laws. The deeply horrifying visual data meticulously recovered by the profoundly sensitive near-infrared spectrograph categorically confirms that the central core of this terrifying anomaly is completely hollow, fiercely indicating that the violent annihilation process has already successfully hollowed out a massive portion of the ancient universe to create a profoundly sterile and totally inescapable cosmic death zone. This catastrophic and completely irreversible cosmic phase transition represents a slow-moving but absolutely mathematically unstoppable tidal wave of pure existential erasure that has been silently and maliciously creeping toward our highly isolated and incredibly fragile Milky Way galaxy for well over 13 billion consecutive years, while we naively gazed up at the seemingly peaceful and static starry night. The fundamental laws of thermodynamics that reliably govern the peaceful mechanical operation of our local solar system are completely violently rendered mathematically useless inside the aggressive boundary of this expanding phenomenon, meaning that any physical matter caught within its terrifying wake does not simply forcefully break apart, but fundamentally ceases to ever have structurally existed in any form. We are violently and tragically forced to desperately acknowledge the profoundly sickening reality that the seemingly beautiful vastness of deep space is actually functioning as an incredibly massive and highly efficient execution chamber, completely meticulously designed to slowly violently funnel our utterly defenseless star cluster directly into the ravenous jaws of this infinitely expanding dark matter storm. If this apocalyptic and self-sustaining dark matter annihilation event has been silently and relentlessly devouring the foundational fabric of reality since the absolute dawn of time, exactly how close is this invisible wave of total cosmic erasure to finally breaching the outer gravitational boundary of our fragile solar system and permanently completely extinguishing every single trace of human existence forever? As we desperately attempt to logically reconcile these three deeply terrifying and mathematically complex astrophysical hypotheses, the completely paralyzed global scientific community is violently forced to finally confront the pathetic biological limits of fragile human cognition when helplessly faced with an impossibly ancient and sprawling architectural reality that absolutely defies basic rational comprehension forever. Our deeply ingrained and fiercely protected psychological need for a perfectly rational and highly predictable mathematical universe is now completely and brutally exposed as a profoundly desperate evolutionary coping mechanism, specifically designed to temporarily shield our fragile biological minds from the blinding, chaotic madness actively raging just outside the microscopic gravitational safety of our isolated star system. Every single aggressively debated and meticulously calculated scientific theory, desperately attempting to logically rationalize the impossible existence of this primordial leviathan, only serves to fundamentally reinforce our absolute and completely terrifying physical helplessness, while helplessly standing in the crushing, oppressive shadow of an unfathomable celestial machinery that fragile humanity was never supposed to witness. The genuinely horrifying and deeply paralyzing philosophical implication of this unprecedented mathematical deadlock heavily suggests that the fundamental underlying architecture of the early primordial cosmos completely operates on a terrifying frequency of pure chaotic hostility that maliciously and actively rejects any pathetic attempt at logical human observation from the incredibly isolated safety of our terrestrial observatories. We are fundamentally and brutally stripped forever of the deeply comforting and highly celebrated historical delusion that continued technological advancement will inevitably and gracefully grant our vulnerable biological species the ultimate intellectual mastery over the infinitely expanding and eternally hostile darkness of the continually surrounding, our remarkably insignificant and entirely defenseless home planet. Staring helplessly and endlessly into the heavily corrupted and mathematically impossible optical telemetry data continuously transmitted from the freezing Lagrange point 2 orbit, our absolutely brightest theoretical minds are systematically and violently mentally broken by the agonizing realization that human reason itself is completely and utterly useless against the crushing gravitational magnitude of this ancient primordial monster. The maddening silence of the great Fermi Paradox is definitively no longer historically viewed as a deeply frustrating scientific mystery, but rather as an entirely inevitable and horrifying psychological consequence of temporarily existing within a fundamentally broken universe that aggressively prioritizes the violently chaotic creation of these massive dark leviathans over the delicate gestation of fragile biological consciousness. Completely accepting the sheer terrifying physical magnitude of these competing apocalyptic astrophysical scenarios fundamentally and aggressively alters the future trajectory of human civilization, permanently shifting our collective cultural focus from the arrogant romanticization of cosmic exploration directly toward a profoundly overwhelming and desperate biological desire to remain entirely hidden from the predatory cosmic abyss. Our seemingly peaceful and highly structured universe is now tragically and violently mathematically revealed to be a meticulously rigged primordial slaughterhouse where the foundational laws of physical reality are constantly and ruthlessly manipulated by completely unfathomable ancient gravitational forces that objectively view the entirety of our fragile Milky Way galaxy as absolutely nothing more than temporary and insignificant fuel. If our highly celebrated and fiercely protected human intellect is entirely biologically incapable of mathematically comprehending the terrifying physical mechanisms violently driving this primordial anomaly, what completely unimaginable and apocalyptic reality-shattering consequences will we inadvertently trigger when our desperate gravitational measurement instruments finally successfully lock onto the rapidly expanding dark matter wake? By aggressively redirecting the highly sophisticated and incredibly sensitive optical arrays of the James Webb Space Telescope away from the deep cosmic abyss, deeply panicked researchers stationed at NASA violently push the near-infrared camera to meticulously measure the extraordinarily subtle astrometric drift of our very own localized solar system against the static background of the universe. These elite astrophysicists frantically attempt to mathematically calculate if the unprecedented and violently warping space-time, continuously emanating from that impossible primordial anomaly, located billions of light-years away, has inexplicably already begun to subtly and aggressively manipulate the highly delicate orbital mechanics strictly governing the peaceful celestial bodies within our local star system. Operating at maximum capacity, the highly advanced internal cryocooler forcefully maintains a blistering absolute temperature of 7 Kelvin to perfectly ensure the finely tuned mid-infrared instrument can flawlessly and accurately detect even the most microscopic and terrifying gravitational ripples continuously washing over the Earth's highly fragile and entirely defenseless planetary magnetic field. The deeply terrifying results completely and absolutely shatter the foundational principles of modern astrometry, as the continuously incoming optical telemetry data explicitly and mathematically confirms a horrifying 99.7% signal anomaly, aggressively indicating that our entire galactic neighborhood is physically and relentlessly drifting toward a massive invisible cosmic structure. Instead of safely following the highly predictable and standard cosmic expansion vectors meticulously mapped out by generations of celebrated scientists, the entire Milky Way galaxy is inexplicably and violently accelerating along a profoundly distorted, localized gravitational gradient that is pointing directly and unyieldingly toward the exact cosmological coordinates of that ancient primordial Leviathan. This deeply terrifying astrometric shift definitively and mathematically proves that the absolutely unimaginable gravitational reach of this sprawling celestial anomaly is fundamentally infinite, miraculously and effortlessly crossing billions of dark light years to actively and maliciously pull our entire completely helpless star cluster directly into its violently churning and hopelessly inescapable abyss. Highly sophisticated and massively powerful spectroscopic arrays, desperately analyzing the localized interstellar medium, violently reveal that this entirely invisible and immense tidal force is already aggressively beginning to subtly but irreversibly stretch the foundational fabric of space-time immediately and dangerously surrounding the perfectly fragile and highly vulnerable orbit of our completely lonely sun. The profoundly agonizing and deeply paralyzing realization that Earth is actively and undeniably already caught firmly within the completely inescapable gravitational undertow of a primordial monster operating at an impossible cosmological redshift of 14, violently and permanently vaporizes any remaining pathetic human hope that we could somehow remain safely isolated from this apocalyptic physical anomaly. As the magnificent and technologically unparalleled James Webb Space Telescope continues to relentlessly and endlessly beam down these highly horrific and deeply corrupted localized spatial distortion metrics, terrified astronomers are violently forced to watch in absolute paralyzing silence as our entire fragile solar system is slowly and methodically dragged into an unfathomable cosmic execution chamber. If this impossibly dark and infinitely expanding primordial gravitational web has already successfully and undeniably ensnared the entire Milky Way galaxy from completely across the absolute farthest edges of observable time, exactly how many terrifyingly brief moments do we genuinely possess before these completely invisible and highly malicious tidal forces violently and permanently rip our precious sun apart? Ever since ancient stargazers first looked up at the night sky in quiet wonder, humanity has maintained a deeply romantic and obsessive historical dream of peering back through the unfathomable depths of time to witness the majestic ignition of the very first stars during the celebrated cosmic dawn, believing that mapping this celestial genesis would finally grant our fragile species a complete and comforting understanding of our cosmic origins. For centuries, pioneering minds like Galileo Galilei, Sir Isaac Newton, and Edwin Hubble constructed increasingly sophisticated astronomical instruments under the firm historical assumption that the early universe was a tranquil, slowly evolving canvas where pristine hydrogen gas gradually condensed over hundreds of millions of peaceful years to gently birth the very first primordial stellar systems across the silent cosmic void. Yet the unprecedented observational data currently streaming from the James Webb Space Telescope brutally exposes that celebrated historical narrative as a total illusion, shattering our deeply cherished concept of the cosmic dawn, and revealing that this glorious curtain of light was actually hiding an impossibly mature, monstrous structural entity that had already been aggressively thriving in the ancient cosmic dark. The proud scientific legacy of every celebrated astronomer who ever lived is instantly reduced to tragic child's play, as their painstaking observations and mathematical formulas are exposed as naive attempts to categorize a tiny, peaceful pocket of space, while completely failing to perceive the titanic, reality-bending phantom that was silently dominating the primordial cosmos long before our sun was even forged. Diving deeply into historical astronomical archives, modern researchers chillingly uncover forgotten 19th century records detailing unexplained optical distortions and localized gravitational anomalies that early observers dismissed as instrument noise, never realizing they were catching the first historical glimpses of an ancient, reality-breaking titan lurking at the absolute edge of time. Every academic textbook historically published across modern human civilization now reads like an embarrassing work of primitive fiction, as our grandest cosmological frameworks were fundamentally constructed on the naive assumption that light was the ultimate benchmark of cosmic creation, rather than merely a temporary, fragile flicker across an infinitely older and vastly darker primordial expanse. The agonizing historical truth, currently paralyzing humanity's leading astrophysicists, is that our species spent thousands of years crafting elaborate, romantic myths about the birth of the stars, completely unaware that we were living inside a temporary sanctuary created in the shadow of a colossal, prehistoric leviathan that had already laid waste to the surrounding universe long before our planet existed. As we look back upon our species' relentless, historical pursuit of scientific truth, we are struck by the haunting realization that every technological advancement was not bringing us closer to cosmic enlightenment, but was instead slowly drawing back a dark, heavy curtain to expose an incomprehensible primordial horror that has been waiting patiently in the shadows for humanity to finally develop eyes capable of seeing it. The historic journey of astronomy, once viewed as humanity's most noble endeavor to decode the beauty of creation, now feels like a tragic historical mistake, as we stand completely paralyzed before this ancient time-breaking monstrosity that fundamentally proves our recorded timeline is merely an insignificant, temporary glitch in an infinitely vast and eternally hostile ocean of ancient dark matter. Now that the brilliant historical foundation of human astrophysics has been forever shattered by this impossible ancient phantom, what apocalyptic realization will consume humanity when we calculate the exact historical timeline of when this ancient monster's expanding gravitational wake will collide with our galaxy, and will our recorded history end in the exact same primordial darkness from which it was once born? Advanced supercomputer simulations running continuously at the highest priority within NASA extrapolate the catastrophic trajectory of this invisible gravitational shockwave, mathematically projecting the exact apocalyptic moment when the primordial entity's relentlessly expanding wake will finally and violently collide with the fragile outer edges of our entirely unsuspecting and defenseless Milky Way galaxy. As this terrifying wall of distorted space-time ruthlessly crashes into our local galactic halo at relativistic velocities exceeding 90% the speed of light. The delicate gravitational balance of billions of dormant comets will be instantaneously shattered, sending a devastating barrage of planetary bombardment, cascading inward toward the inner solar system like an unstoppable cosmic firing squad. The agonizing mathematical projections vividly depict a horrifying future where the familiar and comforting constellations we have gazed upon for thousands of years are violently ripped apart as the oppressive mass of the ancient anomaly ruthlessly bends their starlight into chaotic loops and permanently extinguishes their gentle illumination across the rapidly darkening canvas of our planetary night sky. When the invisible tidal forces of this primordial leviathan finally wrap their crushing cosmic grip around our lonely yellow dwarf star, the delicate thermodynamic equilibrium maintaining solar fusion will be aggressively destabilized, violently triggering apocalyptic solar flares that will effortlessly, completely strip away Earth's protective magnetic field and instantly incinerate our fragile atmosphere. Without the protective atmospheric shield that has peacefully nurtured biological evolution for billions of years, the intense radiation cascading from the warped galactic core will mercilessly sterilize the barren planetary surface, while the escalating gravitational friction actively generates localized seismic ruptures that will systematically tear the Earth's tectonic plates apart from the inside out. This horrifying localized destruction is merely a microscopic footnote within a vastly larger cosmic execution, as the entire majestic spiral structure of the Milky Way is systematically stretched into an agonizingly thin ribbon of superheated plasma that is mercilessly violently dragged, screaming into the unquenchable dark abyss created by this impossibly massive and reality-destroying ancient phantom. We are violently forced to helplessly accept the deeply agonizing realization that our vibrant homeworld will inevitably be permanently erased by the exact same terrifying and incomprehensible dark matter phenomenon that originally birthed this impossible primordial mass in the absolute freezing depths of the early universe, well over 13.8 billion years ago before the theoretical beginning. Desperate researchers aggressively monitoring the continuously updating spectroscopic data arrays are utterly paralyzed by the profound existential terror of watching this simulated cosmic apocalypse unfold in perfectly calculated high resolution, mathematically knowing that there is absolutely no physical mechanism in the known universe capable of successfully halting this violently expanding wave of erasure. Every single magnificent architectural monument, every brilliant scientific achievement, and every agonizingly beautiful biological memory ever created by fragile humanity will be fundamentally physically unmade as the relentless gravitational shockwave systematically completely crushes our localized space-time metric into an absolutely featureless and eternally silent ocean of pure thermodynamic nothingness. If our completely inevitable and violently mathematically guaranteed destiny is to be mercilessly swallowed whole by the exact same ancient cosmic darkness that aggressively destroyed the primordial universe, just how many terrifyingly brief generations of humanity are actually permitted to blindly gaze up at the deceptive stars before the absolute end of reality finally maliciously violently arrives for us? As the final, heavily corrupted packets of ancient telemetry data slowly finish compiling across the frozen monitors of the Space Telescope Science Institute, a profoundly suffocating and absolute silence permanently descends upon the completely shattered minds of humanity's most brilliant and historically celebrated theoretical astrophysicists who finally understand our deeply tragic and pathetic cosmic reality. We are now completely and violently forced to collectively abandon the deeply comforting evolutionary delusion that the vast and seemingly beautiful cosmos was somehow meticulously designed to peacefully nurture the extremely fragile biological emergence of intelligent human life on our remarkably insignificant pale blue dot orbiting an entirely unremarkable yellow dwarf star located in a forgotten galactic backwater. The genuinely terrifying and historically unprecedented discovery of this impossibly mature and violently expansive primordial leviathan definitively proves that the highly celebrated Big Bang was absolutely never the grand genesis of all cosmic creation, but merely a temporary and highly localized thermodynamic spark that is currently being quickly swallowed by an infinitely dark and eternally hostile ocean of predatory mass. The agonizingly silent and heavily debated cosmic void, universally recognized as the Great Fermi Paradox, is finally mathematically solved by the deeply horrific realization that the fundamental architectural fabric of our expanding reality is completely rigged to systematically eradicate any delicate atomic structures long before they can ever successfully achieve the pathetic illusion of an advanced technological civilization. Looking up at the glittering expanse of the planetary night sky will never again invoke the same innocent and historically celebrated sense of human wonder, because we now fundamentally recognize that every single distant star we romantically gaze upon is secretly and inextricably tethered to a violently shifting gravitational web, slowly dragging our entire defenseless solar system toward absolute and irreversible annihilation. Humanity's most triumphant and aggressively defended mathematical achievements and highly romanticized philosophical revelations are instantly rendered completely meaningless in the crushing, oppressive shadow of this ancient cosmic predator that efficiently and ruthlessly rewrote the fundamental physical laws of universal thermodynamics, billions of years before the very first terrestrial oceans ever miraculously managed to form. We are utterly and hopelessly trapped on an insignificantly microscopic rock, blindly hurtling through a thoroughly broken and highly chaotic universe, completely stripped of our historic intellectual arrogance and violently exposed to a primordial slaughterhouse that mathematically views the entirety of our beloved galaxy as absolutely nothing more than temporary kinetic fuel for its own relentless and infinitely dark expansion. The profound and irreversible psychological trauma of successfully decoding this apocalyptic cosmic truth heavily guarantees that human civilization will desperately spend its remaining, terrifyingly brief chronological timeline entirely paralyzed by the absolute dread of mathematically knowing exactly how and precisely when our incredibly fragile localized reality will be permanently erased by this unfathomable ancient leviathan. Every single future attempt to technologically probe the absolute deepest and darkest corners of the observable universe will now be heavily tainted by the sickening, paralyzing fear that our highly sensitive measurement instruments might accidentally attract the active predatory attention of the completely chaotic and violently destructive physical forces silently lurking right behind the distorted primordial cosmic microwave background. If our majestic and universally celebrated cosmic origin story was genuinely absolutely nothing more than a highly fragile and completely temporary localized illusion, perfectly designed to maliciously hide the most terrifying and fundamentally destructive architectural truth in all of existence, exactly what completely irreversible apocalyptic collapse happens to human sanity when the distant stars above us finally begin to violently extinguish.